Hello, students, and welcome back as we begin a brand new chapter on the First World War. So, this really marks a transition in our course where you'll really start to see us transitioning, one, into the 20th century, but also into more modern or more recent history. We're going to start off by talking about the unification of Germany and Italy and basically the rise of these new nations who are going to be participating in what's been called the War to End All Wars. Please title your notes for today, Nationalism and the Rise of Germany. So, just to begin, those who experienced the First World War, the soldiers, the civilians, people who lived through this event, have been nicknamed the Lost Generation for a number of reasons. For one, so many people were actually lost, but so many others were not able to recover from what they experienced. Very little understanding at the time of mental illness or what kind of repercussions of living through this warfare would be like. And I always think it's important to begin topics like this by just looking at the numbers. It's very easy to, look at the number of deaths, of casualties, of people injured, and just kind of put them into a massive pool, a massive number, a massive total. But keep in mind that each one of these numbers is a person, a young man, a young person who had their entire lives in front of them. And it really ends during this conflict, in many cases, quite brutally. Just to take a look at some additional information, it's estimated that we had 38 million casualties during World War I, 18 million deaths, and 20 million wounded. People obviously experienced amputated limbs, horrible mutations from chemicals and gases, what the war things beyond what the world had previously seen. The war also cost $200 billion, which was an astronomical amount of money at the time, and it cost more than any war up to that point. Just to show you very quickly, these are the military deaths of the Triple Entente, or the Allied powers. And here you can see the deaths of the Central Powers, sometimes referred to as the Triple Alliance. You can see that the majority of deaths are on the part of Germany, and we'll talk about the implications of that toward the end of the chapter. I always like to begin this chapter by taking a look at photographs. It's important to note that photographers almost always make their decisions about what they're trying to capture on purpose. So I'm going to show you three different images from three different phases of the war. I want you to take note of colors, shading, the focus, the blur, the orientation, the cropping, and of course, the human countenance, what the human face looks like. And I think it really demonstrates the tone of the war as it progresses. So this one's from 1914. You'll notice Germans enthused going to, World War I, demonstrating their new found power as a unified country. You can see that they're positioned by the Brandenburg Gates, looking very stern and strong in military lines. You can see women giving the men flowers. The expectation during World War I is that these troops would return by that Christmas. They're leaving for war in around July or August. They will be in the trenches for far longer. From the middle of the war, this one is from 1916. And initially, when you look at this photograph, you might notice one or two soldiers, but the more you look at it, the more people you really notice. And you start to realize that these people have become almost a part of the trench itself, that this has become their life, this has become their existence. Accounts from World War I, most of the soldiers comment on the sheer boredom that they experienced, sitting here for hours, days, months, with very little to do other than talk to each other and wither away. And finally, this one is from 1917, the very end of the war. Here you're seeing Austrian soldiers walking through Belgium, which you can see has been almost entirely burnt down. Resembling almost an endless graveyard, it seems as though these men are endlessly lost in this hellish scene that really becomes symbolic for World War I. And we'll talk about interwar art and literature after this chapter. And you'll come to find that these experiences really shape these young men, and it's very difficult for them to ever fully move on past them. So To really understand World War I, we have to first talk about nationalism, one of the concepts that really paves the road toward the First World War. So, after the Congress of Vienna, which we talked about in our chapter on Napoleon, many nations felt this surging sense of nationalism. Their nations were put back together. Napoleon's empire was coming to an end, it was being broken up. We saw the Italian city states, which we talked about a lot throughout this course, finally merge into one and become one unified Italy. Up until this point, all the city states were really their own ethnic identity. So, like, someone would consider themselves to be Sicilian or Genoese instead of being, like an actual Italian. Now we have Italy as one country. And we'll talk about in this lesson how Germany really becomes a new country from the remnants of the Holy Roman Empire, from Prussia and a lot of the German states that are really in this vacuum there. So, Austria was made up of a lot of different ethnic groups, which you can see over there on the map. On the other hand, Prussia was mostly German ethnicity. So, we talked a lot about the development of Prussia under Frederick the Great, and a lot of their rulers, they had the best military, like standing officers in Europe at this time. So the king of Prussia was Wilhelm I, and he sees this opportunity to really unify and make this stronger German government. Initially, he's opposed by parliament, but he gains the support of the Junkers, the higher ups in society. And he wants to expand the empire, and he does this by naming a very famous diplomat, Otto von Bismarck, to be the new prime minister of Prussia. Otto von Bismarck was a Junker. He had a lot of support among the Junker class. Here you can see this famous statesman, Otto von Bismarck, photographed here. So Bismarck becomes a master of what political science people have called realpolitik, which means the politics of reality. Think back in our class, this is very similar to another concept that we've talked about. It's very Machiavellian in concept, where you're really practicing practicalism over idealism. So rather than striving for what might be unattainable, focus on what's directly in front of you and what you can definitely accomplish. And the other part of it is do whatever is necessary for success. King Wilhelm I gives unchecked power to Otto von Bismarck to fight against nearby nations, and Bismarck becomes enormously powerful. He uses the opportunity to go against France, which has really been in endless disarray since the French Revolution. Constant shifting of governments, constant shifting of political parties and political ideas. And Bismarck is very successful in the campaign against them. Here you can see the official unification of Germany in the Palace of Versailles in the Hall of Mirrors after the Prussians and the new German Empire defeated France. The Kaiser becomes the new emperor of this unified Germany, and this new unified German Empire becomes the Second Reich. The First Reich would be the Holy Roman Empire, right? The First Empire. Now we have the German Reich, the Second Empire, and the Third Reich, we'll see, of course, will be Nazi Germany later on in the course. So Prussia plus the German states become this new German empire. Bismarck becomes the chancellor, and Britain and Germany really become the two powerhouse countries of the world at the time. Britain with its superior navy, Germany with its superior military fighting force. So most of the power of these two nations comes from two different concepts. Imperialism, their acquisition of colonies around the world, particularly in Africa and Asia, and militarism, the buildup of these massive military machines. And this image really showcases what the new German Empire is going to look like. So you can see here, this is Prussia. These are the German states left over from the Holy Roman Empire. They come together to be this one empire. As part of the Franco-German War, Germany gets this stretch of France, Alsace-Lorraine. It's enormously profitable, and we'll talk a lot about this stretch of land later on. So just to recap a little bit, we've talked about this previously. Historians typically identify 5 different main causes for World War I, and we typically use the acronym MANIA to describe them. So we have militarism, alliances, nationalism, imperialism, and assassination. So because of the Industrial revolution, we have a lot of improved weapons. We really saw these in action during European imperial expansions into Africa. And what ends up happening is they use this new industrialization to really finance the mass pileup and buildup of these big militaries and navies in Europe. Most nations wanted to double their armies. They had these massive drafts. So you're really having a situation where if there is an event where a nation goes to war, it's going to be particularly deadly because of these massive fighting forces and these new types of technology at the time. Imperialism is also enormously important. It was making nations very wealthy, which gave them the ability to finance these militaries, particularly Britain and France, and now the newly unified Germany and Italy. Germany starts making secret treaties with other nations to form alliances. They enter into a very, very important alliance with Austria in 1879. And the main goal of this alliance is to isolate France, which you can see pictured here in this cartoon, where you can see Germany and Austria basically making alliances with everyone except for France, kind of cutting them out of the equation. Again, this is the realpolitik, perspective on politics. Otto von Bismarck realizing that he can take advantage of this situation with France and use it to his advantage. And you can see that these are the alliance networks before World War One. Most notably, there's Russia, the United Kingdom, Great Britain at the time, and France. They are the Allied powers, sometimes referred to as the Triple Entente. And then there is Germany, Austria, Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, which is much smaller at this time, which are the Central Powers, sometimes referred to as the Triple Alliance, which gets a little bit confusing. For the sake of our class, we're going to refer to them as the Central and Allied Powers. Think of it this way: the Central Powers are in the central part of Europe, the Allied Powers surround them. So Kaiser Wilhelm II is the son of Kaiser Wilhelm I, and he comes to power in 1890, and he really wants to solidify power in himself. He doesn't want to share power with Otto von Bismarck, who really is the de facto leader of the German Empire up until this point. And you'll see that this becomes extremely important later on. So in 1887, Otto von Bismarck had negotiated a secret treaty with Russia called the Reinsurance Treaty, basically kind of giving them insurance in case something was to happen. And basically the idea of this treaty was they promised neutrality against each other if either side declared war on a different country. So basically, like if Russia went to war with a different country, Germany would stay out of that conflict and not get involved, and Russia would do the same. But at the time, there was a stipulation because of pre-existing alliance networks. Russia had an alliance with France. Germany had an alliance with Austria, so it didn't extend to attacks on those nations. So like if Germany attacked France, Russia could still get involved. If Russia attacked Austria, Germany could still get involved. But after Bismarck is forced to step down in 1890, it's not renewed. Many historians wonder that if Bismarck was allowed to stay in power, if further negotiations of this would have actually prevented the First World War from happening at all. So the Balkans is the southernmost tip of Europe. In terms of geography, you can think of it as being close to Italy. We often think of it as this powder keg, as this very turbulent portion of the continent that's most likely to have an issue. Serbia, which is in the very, very south of the Balkan Peninsula, has a very high Slavic population, and nationalism was inspiring Slavic people to unite and come together. Austria-Hungary was not particularly happy about this. Just to show you very quickly, this is a map, and you can see this is Serbia right here. Again, very high Slavic population. Austria-Hungary, very ethnically mixed, not particularly fond of Slavic people. Serbia wants to take Bosnia, which also has a Slavic population, and make one unified country between them. And that becomes really the inciting incident of World War I. If you look at this map of Austria-Hungary, you can see that there really is a massive chasm ready to emerge with all of these different ethnic groups who are kind of at each other's throats. A concept that's really important to understanding the outbreak of World War I is what's called Pan-Slavism. Pan, a root word meaning across, and Slavism referring to Slavic peoples. Basically, this is when Slavic people share a common identity. Russia was the most powerful Slavic country in the world. Smaller Slavic states often looked to Russia for their leadership and guidance. So, if Russia did not defend a smaller Slavic nation that was being threatened, it would really diminish its authority. And to kind of end things off, in 1908, Austria Hungary annexed Bosnia, that portion of the map that I just showed you that had that high Slavic population. Serbia is infuriated. They want Bosnia to be part of Serbia, part of their country, and they vow to take Bosnia back. We'll see in our next lesson when we start to talk about Archduke Franz Ferdinand that it's really his assassination that kicks off the First World War, and the motivation of the terrorist cell that carries out his execution, the Black Hand, is motivated by this.